Well, brothers and sisters, the subject of tonight's premiseless presentation is the McDonaldization of human thought. Just like you, over the last few days or months or hours, I have seen such headlines and articles as franchising the last outpost for the small businessman, franchising the business structure of the 1990s, such as that. And as you might suspect, since I brought it up, I believe that there is, as always, but specifically an internal representation that life has done on men that is reflected again inwardly and outwardly in the great area known as franchising. And one thing about franchising, those of you that never thought about it, I'll have you think about it right quick. Franchising gives what they claim to be, and from a certain relative view, gives a kind of boost for a small person to plug into a larger operation with a larger amount of their buying power and cooperative advertising. And so it would indeed seem to fit in, without any doubt, reasonably to such articles and such ideas as franchising the last outpost, the new outpost even, of the small businessman, when in fact, if you'll listen right quick to yourself as I jog you, it's not really so. Because being a franchisee actually puts a kind of chill. It in fact brings about a certain kind of captivity to one's so-called entrepreneurial spirit, in that you have swapped a certain kind of safety net and captivity for a limited amount of, you have swapped your captivity for a certain amount of a kind of safety net and semi-promised profitability. Relatively speaking, a person who took on a franchise, for those of you that I didn't make that clear enough, a fellow out working on a salary, working for someone else. Relatively speaking, of course, if he ends up with a burger doodle franchise somewhere, borrows the money, kills an uncle for the insurance, or however he gets it, relatively speaking, you can say the man is now in business for himself, that there is a certain kind of entrepreneurial spirit involved with his undertaking, literally so, that he now does not receive a salary, he's now his own boss. But insofar as franchising offering a kind of real freedom, it does not. Well, it's no great secret, and if you're tied up into the regular world, you're not supposed to look at it from this view anyway. It's not that it's a conspiracy, because, I repeat, relatively speaking, as always, within the general framework of life, one thing can be true and correct, that is operational, and then from a more complex view, and sometimes even just from a linear view, a parallel view, it is not exactly that way. Being a franchisee is not freedom. For instance, I was going to just give you one little area in case you'd never had occasion to think about it. A real franchisee is not free because they cannot buy their supplies, their food stuff, if we're going to talk about food for a second, since I did that silliness about the McDonaldization of human thought, although I kind of like that, if somebody write that down. Doesn't that explain why sometimes you feel like that your head is full of mayonnaise with little chopped up pickles in it? Or at least cheap meat. A franchisee, what I was going to say, if you don't know it, is not free. Somebody has a McDonald's franchise, is not free to buy their napkins, their straws, their meat, their mayonnaise, anywhere they want to. They cannot go out, and anybody that happens to be an attorney, there's some case laws I don't want to go into, but generally speaking, you are tied into the contract. You have got to buy all your supplies from McDonald's, or if they picked out a third party. You cannot set your own hours. You have to operate when they want to. You cannot have a sale. Burger King's, Long John Silver's, Taco Bell's. The local franchisee cannot decide, well, I'm going to cut prices for 2 weeks. You cannot do that. So what you have done to be a franchisee is you have picked up a kind of illusion of freedom with a kind of built-in safety net. That is, assuming that you took on a major franchise, that there is almost a certainty if you worked reasonable hours, like 90 hours a week, is a pretty reasonable certainty that you can stay in business. Now this kind of illusion, although it's real enough, I'll repeat for the last time, relatively speaking, compared to some guy who had been working at a 7-Eleven store on an assembly line, there is a certain kind of freedom now, because nobody's telling him specifically, no other individual, no manager, no line boss is telling him that you got to be in here at 9 o'clock. It is simply part of the arrangement that he knows he's got to be there, but it's like nobody can tell him what to do. If he goes broke, it was his fault. If he decides that he should work harder, he tells himself to work harder. So there is that relativity of freedom, but it is in fact an illusion of freedom. That is, you have given up a certain kind of freedom of serving the menu you want to, keeping your own hours you want to, setting your own prices. You've given that up for a certain kind of relative safety net in you being a part of a larger operation. Whew, comma. Now, could I point out to you that this is not dissimilar to you being a franchisee for the franchisor life? Although you did not know that you had stepped in that position. What I have just described, assuming that you didn't go to sleep or pulling your hair out through all that about burger doodles and Dairy Queens and a Prince and a Duke here or there, consider that if you looked at yourself as being a franchisee of life, that what you have done in being a franchisee would be just simply being ordinary, going by your old established intelligence, the way that life wires up people in general. What you have done is you have given up a kind of course you didn't know that you were giving it up, but you have, in a sense, if you're following this allegory, you have given up a kind of at least potential freedom for a kind of safety net, a kind of almost built-in semi-profitability of your undertaking. That is, if you do more or less what life wants to, you'll make a living. That is, you're supposed to live 72.5 years, you'll live it. Probably not living in the street, and you'll have a home of some kind. And so that you'll get by, and your franchise, that is, of you being you, instead of looking at it as Burger King, I'll look at it as being Gottlieb and Grunhilde, whoever your name is, that is your franchise. But it is not, in the sense of the headlines, franchising the last outpost of the small businessman. Look at it this way. Being you, the last outpost of an ordinary person, of a regular guy. Notice I didn't go far enough to say as a Pogita brain, but just an ordinary person being a franchisee, that is going along with the plan. As you signed up, let us say, I'll jump back and forth as always in the middle of a parable, not actually changing streams, but at least jumping about from the bank back. Like with the franchise, out in ordinary life, if you signed up for McDonald's, you have taken on the obligation, you have agreed to all of their general demands. Their general demands for all of their franchises all over the country is that, well, I don't know what it is, but 7 days a week, if the law allows it in that state. 7 days a week you have got to be open for business from 7:30 until 11:30. Let's just say that's it. You have agreed to that. And it's not open to any discussion. And you have agreed that you will sell only those things that McDonald's dictates. You will not decide to sell sauerkraut soufflés to go. You will sell what they want, and you do not set your prices. They may vary, for all I know, from areas of the country, but they will dictate at least what your particular area, the prices that you'll be charging. And in return for that, you have you're part of the mass advertising, which you pay for, but you're a part of it. You don't have to worry about finding an advertising agency. You don't have to worry about writing up your own copy. You don't have to worry about picking out what uniforms that the crew will wear. Everything is decided for you. It's known as a turnkey operation. You pay your money and you walk in. Does that not sound like, although, as always, you cannot refer to ordinary existence, that is, the ordinary thinking, that in some way you, prior to becoming a franchisee, that you were actually salaried. So we got to jump in, as always, and create a certain kind of artificial distinction wherein I'm just saying now you could look upon yourself. If you're ordinary, you couldn't. Ordinary thought won't do it, but you ought to be able, some of you now, to be able to look upon yourself is there is a certain kind of similarity that you are almost a franchisee of this large organization, to say the least, life. And if you go along with it, which you're supposed to, it's an unspecified, unsigned, invisible contract, as opposed to you at one time handing your, whatever it is, $500,000 to McDonald's and signing the contract. It's like this has happened beyond your attention, that you have signed up this contract with life, which you have done whether you did or not, as long as you think what you're supposed to think, as long as your concerns are those concerns that are general to everybody, and that's as far as it goes. That is, you do not think more than you have to. You have then, you might say, gained a certain kind of relative safety, a certain kind of almost promised profit. It may be very small, and you may literally, some of you laugh, but you might end up, as you very well might, with a McDonald's, if you don't know it, they're not simply gold mines. But some of these franchisors end up working 90 or 100 hours a week, and they may not end up with any more net in their pocket than they did when they were working on the assembly line for General Motors. But many people enjoy it, that I am now my own boss. I own this McDonald's. So you have gained a certain kind of safety, almost if you go by their contracts, you go by their rules, you have almost gained an assurance of a certain kind of profit. If you go along with life, rather than go along with this kind of insanity, this kind of stuff, doing something unusual, not ordinarily weird and unusual, because that's going along with life, because life needs some ordinary weird people. So we're not talking about ordinary weirdness, we're talking about unusual weirdness. I don't have time to go into what ordinary and extraordinary weirdness would be. So, but you would be, by going along with life's general demands, you'd be gaining a certain kind of relative freedom, almost a built-in profit, maybe very small, and what you have given up is a kind of freedom, although you're not knowing it. Doing this you might look at as being outside the area of either salaried employment or the franchise situation. This comes closest to actually being out on your own, but really on your own. No premise, no business, no franchise, nobody setting your hours, that is, nobody telling you what to do, nobody telling you what the menu has to be and what to charge. What kind of demand would that be if we could translate this some way into ordinary operations in life? If we could take this and in some way move it apparently outside of one individual human nervous system, what kind of demand would there be for that? How would you run an ad under the business opportunities, let us say, in the classified section? Not under help wanted, because we're past that. You're not on salary. So you'd have to move up, you might say, relatively speaking, from you sitting around, if you're unemployed, looking under help wanted, male or female, or whatever your case may be. You move over to, you got a few dollars in your pocket. Our Uncle Henry is beginning to look a little weak, so maybe you'll be coming in some money. So you look under the column of business opportunities, where you might find a franchise. But where would you list something like this if it were a business? That is not for sale, it has no location, it has no business product or service that's easily identifiable, and you can do it, and nobody tells you what hours to do it. If you decide, well, I do want to do it, and you met somebody that seemed to be interested or had been around the same thing, they say, well, by God, do it. I know what you're talking about, and I know what you're talking about. I don't want to say any more. And they say, well, how often should I do it? You know, what hours should I keep? Should I start doing it early in the morning and maybe knock off for lunch? Should I do it 7 days a week? If I did it 7 days a week rather than say, let's say every other day, would I be twice as good at it? Would I make twice as much? What if I took off 2 or 3 months and just didn't do it? Would I lose all my business? Which is a real shrug, because the unspoken response to that is, what business? What are you going to lose? And a little story recently, I let somebody say this, I don't think it made it on tape, but here is where it was really, in one sense, applicable, because you could say that what I'm describing is like having the, quote, freedom of adventure without the adventure. Or without the freedom, for that matter. See, now, the night we did that originally, the room was pretty silent. I guess it's the way you tell it. Some people can tell them and some can't. Well, what I just said, some of you should be able to do on your own. I could turn that absolutely backwards in a 3D sense and say just the opposite would be a real description. That is, did you follow that? All right. You could say the ordinary existence, being a franchisee of life, you could say is having the freedom of adventure without the adventure or the freedom. That's ordinary life. But if you can do it real, real fast in your own brain, I could say this is the ultimate spirit of adventure, but you're not locked into, you're not limited to any 3D definition of what adventure or freedom is. It's irrelevant. May I suggest that not unconnected to the opening shot regarding franchising would be an example not too distant in ordinary advertising that we have mentioned once or twice before, but in a very specific way. You could look upon advertising as being an absolutely splendid example of another phenomenon that we were talking about a few tapings back, that is, of the human intellect being able to make things more than they are. Now, this in no sense is a beginning of a pejorative inquiry or denunciation of advertising. But advertising is a living, material, sensual example that seems to be going on in the ordinary world out there that is just exemplary of the human intellect, in part being in charge of, being responsible for making things at the secondary level more than they are. An ad that's running on television right now. It's for some soap. Human soap, not dishwashing soap. And part of the ad is this athlete. It's a guy running, and they give the name of the soap. The guy's smiling and bursting through it, the tape on some sort of race or something. And the voice says, such and such soap, another of your peak experiences. I'm going to trust that there is no sarcasm or cynicism in your laugh, because that's not the point. But if any of you that there were any, I'll pretend that you were just playing what I normally do, that you jump back right quick and you're playing the part of ordinary intelligence, ordinary thinking. Because ordinary thinking would be very easy. Some social critic, some TV critic could immediately laugh and say, my God, are they really stretching now? Is Madison Avenue finally getting off the deep end to say that the soap in some way is that kind of peak experience that you sometimes can get after you've run 114 miles on an empty stomach at 2 in the morning? Well, all of you are physical enough that you know what they mean by now, what they think they mean. But when they talk about a peak experience, the joy of movement, just the good old motor system of the body under the right circumstance, that kind of fun that they even now try and turn into some kind of transcendental new age peak experience. But an ordinary intelligence, an ordinary social critic in last body could go, hey, I know what that is. And Jesus, aren't we getting just a bit tenuous to call using a certain kind of soap as a peak experience? Come on. Tut tut. Ooh, tut tut. Think about what the human intellect is doing. Don't worry about the advertising agency that came up with this. Just look at it as the human intellect. It's all quiet, valid. It's a great example. Showing an athlete, whatever it is, a 15 or 20 or 30-second ad, and showing somebody running, and nowadays a good middle class identifies with that so-called healthy lifestyle, and the guy running and smiling and really enjoying himself. So that's enough that you know, if you're ordinary, you might look at that if you're watching TV and go, yeah. And then the intellect is making it more, attempting to, than it is. Not only is that fun, the unsaid part, not only getting out and doing that, but later, get in, take a shower, and use this soap, and it's another peak experience. When from any ordinary, reasonable view, if you were ordinary and reasonable, middle-class thinkers, you'd go, well, it's not the same. But people ordinarily watching TV, or if it was in print media, are not sitting there playing cynic all the time. A peak experience with soap. So do you hear that literally, you could say, from a literal, reasonable view, they are stretching. But the human intellect is now, it's just a great example, again taking something and making more out of it than it was there. As it should. Let's assume that this campaign is going to work. There's no reason to think it won't. And let's assume that their sales of their soap will go up. That means, let's say that that's the only ad they're doing. And subtracting some percentage of just accidental people picking up the soap just because they like the wrapper, then you're just going to have to assume that it's operating in life's best interest, that life has actually made that campaign work, that there are people that are now buying the soap. Of course, if we were playing psychological lemmings of all these kind of operations, you would then say something like, well, it's a kind of subliminal message has been absorbed by certain people who did not give it a strong analytical look at, and so they are just unconsciously picking up that soap because they in some way want to identify with being healthy and being athletic, even if they're not. They can say all that, and it's not that it's not true, but that's just simplistic. That's a childish description. If you're going to try to ever do anything outside ordinary thought, it very likely will work to some degree. So what has happened? You've got to forget all about soap itself. Forget about people trying to identify with other apparent healthy yuppies that, yeah, that's where I want to be. Forget all that. What we're talking about is there's certain forms of energy. There's certain amounts of energy going on in a certain area, and the human intellect is in charge of churning that up, of stirring up the accounts. That it can make things at the secondary level. It cannot at the primary level, because the human intellect cannot create goods. But in a sense, it is almost as though it can take the primary goods and create more and more services. It's almost as though the human intellect is in charge of taking something that, well, let's see, what's this? I believe that's a lump of dirt. Well, let's see, what could we do with that? And let's say for a couple of thousand years, the only thing they could think to do with it was to throw it at each other. And then maybe one day a guy says, I know, I'll eat it. I don't. It's like the human intellect has to continually, well, did I make that too simple? Finally, some guy looks at it and he says, that's not just dirt. There's some iron ore in there. I know what I'll do. I'll build a Buick. You know? Or at least a V8 engine. That is, the human intellect takes the goods, takes things at a primary level and continues to expand them into areas that other parts of life body may be critical of, such as laughing at the ad about a peak experience of soap. It may be some small part. The laughter may finally overcome the campaign and the company abandon it. But it's not simply because one area of life's body points at some other area and goes ha ha and is critical of it. Those of you that's been around this for any length of time know better than that. That tells you nothing. That's part of the operations of life growing. But this is just another prime example going on of the intellect making of things that are already at a primary, a secondary level to start with by the time you notice it, by taking those and expanding them. Can you also see that advertising of this sort and other things, but since I'm here on advertising, can you see that this is another example of the need and the manifestation, that is, of the intellect making things more than they are? This is part of what would seem to be the development of human intelligence. It is part of the basis of people telling you what kind of guy they are. That's what that ad is. All right, let me fall back to make it, if we were using psychological descriptions, if that was the basis of this, and a psychologist, or if I was an ordinary psychologist and said, oh, this ad is appealing to people's desire to identify with being athletic and being like this guy looks like he's nice middle class, or he gets through running, they show him, and sure enough, he walks up to his BMW and whips out a monogrammed towel, and he puts on his Rolex, and then it shows the soap. They could say, well, that's what they're trying to sell it, is if you use the soap, that in some subliminal way you'll remember this, and you'll think the soap's going to make you that way. All right. Back to what I've described to you. The need for everybody to tell you what kind of guy they are. Do you understand that that's part of what's going on here in this? That if their description, if that's all there was, that people who would buy the soap, that would be driven to buy the soap by this ad because of psychological blah, 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 blah. If that's all there was, then even I am showing you now an improvement on that. Because it's not just that, even if it went no further. A better, a more complex way to even look at it at that level would be all of this is a continual reinvention, not of the wheel, a continual reinvention of, hey, that's the kind of guy I am. That you were already some kind of guy, if you're ordinary, but now you see that and they're talking about another, and the part it didn't say, instead of just another of your peak experiences, it's saying another of your kind of guys' peak experiences. Yeah. Even if you don't buy the soap, but right then, let us say, as psychologists might call it, that you identify with the ad and the guy and the watch and the monogram towel and the Rolex. And a peak experience, you like the term peak experience. Sounds so California-ish, New Age-ish. And so you are identifying with that, but what you're really identifying is an expansion. It's the human intellect, a retelling, a reinvention. It's an expansion of, that's the kind of guy I am. That's what fads are about. Fads are not just hula hoops. Fads are here. Fads are a continual expansion that, well, I'm already the kind of guy I am. Not primarily. I'm already the kind of guy I've been saying I am. But it's like you're kind of tired of it. Like, clothes. I've had them for 10 years, 2 years, 6 months. I need to be, if not a completely different kind of guy, I need to be more of a kind of guy that I am. So what could I do? And suddenly it's this soap called the new kind of guy soap. And you think, yeah, the peak experience soap. Yeah. If we were nothing but psychology-based, if that's all this sort of stuff were, let me point out, staying there just a second, that what seems to be the personality development of children, personality development of men, the first thing that the human mind does, the development itself, they might call it a personality, which all you're seeing is the development of the nervous system into the talking area of the brain. The first thing that a person's brain thinks of is, hey, what kind of guy am I? The first thing it says is the kind of guy I am. Now, you may think that a kid, the first thing it says is mama or daddy or poo-poo, but what it's really saying is, I'm a kind of guy after all, and here's the kind of guy I'm going to be. Or here's the kind of guy I am right now. That is the first thing the human brain does, is attempt to say, well, hey, I'll tell you the kind of guy I am. And such things appear to be advertising, and many, 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 many other things can be seen as being a kind of expansion, a kind of retelling, a kind of reinvention, a kind of new wardrobe, a new fashion for a particular person's intellect, if not this year, maybe just this month or this week. If I tell you the kind of guy I am. While I'm here at advertising, there's another one. Let me use an example for something really subtle. Since we don't seem to be playing the Bismarck and Titanic again tonight. Yep. There's an ad, and it shows a couple of basketball players, and the voice says, the voiceover said, 2 unstoppable forces. But then it turns out, I'm not going to try to quote anymore, the camera angle changes, they say a little more, but that was the lead-in, that was the kind of the hook of the ad. Now here it is, obviously 2, maybe it gave their names, but it was 2, a couple of real, look like basketball players, and the voice says 2 unstoppable forces. And then it does some other graphic or something. The camera goes down, and they're talking about the shoes. It turns out it's an ad for the basketball shoes, the running shoes, the company, Nike or whoever it was. But what you have here, the 2 ways that I could try and turn your attention to this, because it gets into a real subtle area of the human intellect, making things more than they are. That is, continuing to expand the secondary activities of humanity. Because then you can say, well, the ad turns out that was kind of a visual and verbal trick to show first these couple of players and say 2 unstoppable forces. And there they stand. And then the camera goes down and it shows just one of them's both of his feet. And then it flashes on there, wherever it is, the Jump High Shoe Company. And then you go, oh, pretty clever. They said 2 unstoppable forces. And at first I thought it was the basketball players, but what they're saying, the 2 unstoppable forces are the 2 shoes that each of them have on. So you say, well, they weren't talking about humans. They were talking about goods. They were talking about a product. Right? That's what they're trying to sell. They're not trying to sell you 2 basketball players. They're trying to sell you a pair of shoes. So the 2 unstoppable forces are not the 2 players, the 2 users of the product. It's the product. Obvious, right? It's not obvious. There is no such thing as a product without a user. And I got to admit, I'm a little pleased that a few people got it, and boy, it sure does tempt me as always just to drop it and go on. Because ordinary intelligence, of course I can't resist trying to hit some more of you, ordinary intelligence would tell you that, God, that stinks as usual. that something's wrong because they're actually trying to sell you shoes or soap. Well, sure they are, if that's as far as you can take it. But there is no such thing as goods without users. And so you can say, well, the ad said 2 unstoppable forces, and the camera went down, and it's shoes. It's not shoes. Where it says, another of your peak experiences, and it's showing a guy running. And you think, yeah, I identify with that, because sometimes I run, I feel good, and it's like an unusual, I'm glad I did it. And then it flashes soap, and it shows this guy later in the shower, and smiling like, boy, is this something. And so you can say, well, they're trying to sell soap, but they're not. Oh, yeah, they are. I know that. But there is no such thing as a product without a user. Do you hear me? If nobody took baths, they could mount all the campaigns in the world that they want to for soap, and nobody would buy it. Now don't listen to your old intellect go, well, Jesus, is that simple? No, it ain't. If nobody wore shoes, there's no way that they could sell shoes. I mean, they could give away free McDonald's. They could give away free soap with every shoe. But if nobody wore shoes, if there were no users for shoes, there's no way that they could sell shoes to anybody. Of course, they wouldn't be trying. Well, there wouldn't be any shoes. But as always, I've got to jump in the middle of what apparently is a 3D reasonable world and artificially and arbitrarily set this up. The advertising. For those of you that want a parenthetical, you can take religion, philosophy, all forms of human thought, all areas of secondary activities. But since I started off using the springboard of advertising, all advertising is making reference. No matter how it looks, it is making reference to products and the user, because there would be no product without the user, comma. Now, would you like to consider this? The validity having to do with the human intellect, like the thought processes, that it's not the thoughts, it's not information, that is, it's not the goods per se, it's not the products, but it's the people who use them. I guess that's always a form of progress, that I started out this section and had X amount of people heard something and push it a little further and we're down to X over 27. All right, I'll back up. Some of you heard this quite clearly, as weird as it was, that they're not actually selling shoes, because you cannot separate any sort of human, secondary, or human products, human goods. You cannot separate it from the use of it. It would not exist were it not for the use of it. But then look, those of you that thought you had that a few minutes ago, you could look upon knowledge, information, as being a product. An ordinary intellect takes it as being a product. People spend money to buy a book that says, this book tells you everything you need to know about tuba repair work at home. And you think, well, I'm paying $29.95 because it's going to tell me how to do bathroom repairs with silly putty. It is information. I am buying a product, this book, and the information is a product, but it's not. It is not in any way, cannot be separated from the use. Let's assume that you have no interest in the tuba. You don't own a tuba, you don't like tuba music. You wouldn't have a tuba if someone lent you one. So would you buy a book on how to do tuba repairs, minor repairs at least, at home? What if it was on sale, half price? Would you buy it? What if it was 90% off and you walked through the store and there was this sign up? Tuba repairs at home, 90% off today only. Would you even notice it? Sensually, if it could be, which it could, but there's no point, it could actually be measured. The light waves from that sign, you might have turned around and actually something hit you, like tuba may have actually gotten into your little rods and cones and went into your eyeball and got into your brain, and it actually hit there, but it meant no more than you just turn around and seeing if you're a man selling women's shoes. Assuming you're not a cross-dresser. It just, essentially, you were exposed to it, but it was meaningless. It was not operational. That is, you had no use for it. So the book, you can say, and I'm using book now as like a depository, a physical manifestation of knowledge. You cannot separate that from a user. You cannot separate any product from the user. And yet, things are wired up in such a way with ordinary people that they believe that information itself is the key, or knowledge itself. That if you want to know something, What you want is the knowledge about how to do it. That is, you want a product. Somebody tell me, and you're saying, give me a pair of shoes or a bar of soap, what this is. What is the knowledge that I'm lacking? At the ordinary level, there's nothing wrong with that. But please note, those of you that still remember such things, every time you try to do that in the ordinary world, that you're trying to scratch a place in your own intellect that itched. Everything that was for sale, everything that was actually a product that you tried, never did fit. It never did soothe the itch. But if you stayed ordinary, you're just simply wired up to believe, well, I hadn't found the right soap yet. I haven't found my shoe size yet. Now, even I admitted that was getting pretty subtle. Well, let's get half subtle. How about a technological distinction? Get away from advertising into a more roll up your sleeves and get grease under your... Is it your eyebrows or your fingernails? Does everybody remember, at least you probably heard about it, the development of Alexander Graham Bell of the microphone? And at the time, it was an improvement. It was a lineal improvement over the telegraph, when they could send the human voice, sounds themselves, of information over wires, and it was an improvement over the telegraph. Well, would you like to say exactly how? Yes, I will, because I'm sure you've got something in mind. The telegraph. You all heard of that, dot, did, which was just amounting to cutting off and on an AC current, or a DC current. That every time you mashed it, what you were doing was cutting the current and then laying it back on, and it would go into dots and dashes. As you've seen Gabby Hayes sing there in a movie, you know, doing this. But I want you to consider the kind of improvement. The microphone, I'm not going to try to describe what, but it was carbon elements and electrical current setting up a magnetic field, and as you all know, you can speak into a microphone, which is a telephone nowadays, same thing. And the sound of the human voice actually traveled over the wires. But up until then, what you had was the dots. And the guy at one end sending, he knew the Morse code. Each letter had a series of dots and dashes. And so what they had done was take, a man comes in to send a telegraph, and he says, "Dear Fred." So the guy goes, da-da-da-da-da-da. He takes the sound of the human voice, which was direct information, "Dear Fred." But before the microphone, there was no way to send the information direct. They had to take "Dear Fred" and turn it into dots and dashes. And so he'd say, "Dear Fred." Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He sends a message. It goes over the wires, comes out the other end, and a guy sitting there listens to the dots and dashes, and then he retranslates it. He reassembles the information. There was no longer direct information. It's not the direct transmission of information, because unless you were trained in it, and if you were, it's the same thing, but if you weren't trained in it, you wouldn't have any idea. If you're staying at the other end waiting to hear, and you're Fred, and there's nobody there to operate the telegraph, and here it comes in, pouring in, you hear it, dot, and you may even just know for a fact, or you suspect, this is the message I'm waiting for. It's meaningless, because in a sense it's not information. Follow me a second. It is not really information. It's instructions on how to reassemble information. Think about it. In one real sense, I'm not just playing with words, although in the 3D sense you could say that. But wait a minute. You're not going anywhere for a second. It is not direct relay and conveyance of information. They took the information that here the guy is paying his money, that's saying, all right, the message is, "Dear Fred, will arrive Wednesday." And the guy goes, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He takes the information and he breaks it down into a code, which of course they call it a Morse code, But what comes out the other end, although it can end up after this one stage of the operator at that end translating it, in a sense it was not the information that came out the other end. It was instructions on how to reassemble information. The change was not just being able to do away with an operator between you and the other end and the information, but was the information itself. Because if you pick up the phone, you say, "Hey Fred, this is me, I'll be there Thursday." The sound, in this sense, the energy that is human information, is now direct, as opposed to it simply being sounds that were instructions on how to reassemble information. That the dot, the did was instructions on, all right, take these and put them back together as words, and then you'll have the information. The microphone, in a sense, turned the instructions on how to reassemble information. It bypassed that, and the information went directly. Comma. Could any of you begin to suspect, begin to feel through your own experience, that when you're able to do whatever this thing is on your own, it is like a bypassing. It is like then beginning to understand that what's normally referred to as information, which is fine. The Morse code served civilization quite admirably. But in a sense, ordinary information is not actually information. That which is floating around in the general wiring system in life that is man. It is not actually information. It's instructions on encouraging one to try and assemble information, to put together some information, to maybe go look for some information. But the very things in the ordinary world compared to whatever this kind of thing is, relatively speaking, compared to that, it is not actually a microphone connection. It is not a microphone direct conveyance of information between people in life's body. It's not really information, it's sounds going back and forth of a kind of encouragement, a kind of hint, a kind of crude template, a kind of simplistic encouragement, a sketch that maybe these instructions could be reassembled or put together in some way and might produce actual information. That is, you might be able to take the dots and the dashes, and if you knew what you were doing, they may not just be dots and dashes, they may turn to something else. Because dots and dashes are fine. But these dots and dashes, that is ordinary information, might turn out to be something else. The very thing that just seems to be that you take now as information might be on another level, simply instructions about how to reassemble it. You could look at it almost as being going from a cruder facsimile conveyance of information into a more complex, wider stage to where it's no longer a facsimile transmission of information, but be more on the level of an equivalency, which is what it amounts to with a telephone, with a microphone. That what you say, speaking to Fred in New York, what you say is the equivalent of what he hears, the sound through Mr. Bell's invention, the sound now that he hears, the sound wave, which is the 3D level, we're talking about information. What Fred hears in Los Angeles is equivalent to what you said. Whereas when it was operating on the basis of Morse code, it was not the equivalent, it was a facsimile. That it had to be reconstructed. Somebody had to translate it. It had to go from one form to another. But compared to that, do you understand, the transmission along radio, around telephone lines, would be the equivalent. It is not a facsimile. It is a direct transmission. You say, "Hello, Fred?" Fred says, "Yes." But if it's dot, 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 you have to go, "Hello, Fred." All right. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Let's say you know how to do it. And Fred knows how to receive it. So he's sitting out there. It travels just as fast. But he doesn't hear you say, "Hello, Fred." He's got to take at least the time to go, da-da-da-da-da-da. "Oh, hello, Fred." Okay. Then you go, "We'll be there Wednesday." Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He hears it. "We'll be there Wednesday." It is not a direct equivalency of what he said. It is not a direct transmission of the sound, of the energy, of the information. Could you, based upon what you have already experienced yourself, get a taste that, relatively speaking, not that the ordinary transmission of information does not serve its purposes quite admirably in ordinary life, but that which you get that begins to excite your own brain, that begins to seem to have some profitable effect on that kind of itch, that kind of interest that you at one time started out with in your brain, that the information does not come about in some way that it was a translation, that it does not seem, now that I pointed out, you should be able to hear some, it does not seem that there was some agent between you and the information. That is, the telegraph operator, that you had to go, what's that noise coming in? Now, of course, instead of telegraph operator, I can put in all kinds of things there. Priest, rabbi, mother, father, friend, anybody. But normally it's apparently somebody in a position of authority, that you could see that if you wanted to move from a priest or a rabbi or some kind of shaman or some psychologist or some philosopher, instead of that, would not somebody of a less sophisticated position right now in life, if they had never seen a telegraph in operation, as outdated as that is, if you ran telegraph wires and lines and stuff in operation in some more primitive area of this planet right now, they would take it as magic. That you could know things going on in a village 20 miles away, and you could put on these earphones or hide them under a turban. And you could make pronouncements. You could say, I'm getting messages from the guides that over at such and such village, you know where some of your relatives live? And I'll go, yeah. Over there right now, they're being attacked. A raiding party from afar. Or they're having a party, whatever it was. And they could run and check and find out you were correct. And it was like you were going, I'm getting messages. There's always an agent involved. There's always some part of the general scheme of the human nervous system in general talking, which is part of the role that advertising is playing. When it's a facsimile of information, there's always, apparently, some agent. You just don't normally identify it. Somebody tell me, what's the information I'm looking for? Somebody tell me. If it's not a priest or a rabbi or some religious garbed figure, it's a book. It's something that you're looking for, the correct soap, these shoes that are just fit you to a T, the information that's just right. But the information is always some facsimile. That from a more complex view, the information is not really information. The information, at best, for the purposes of somebody doing this, the information would-be instructions on how you might go about reassembling or constructing the information you're looking for. But all you're getting, once you get your fill of what it is, you find out that's not real information. It's by God, ... which is all right, but that is not direct information. They have taken the original equivalency of the sound, that is the energy, and they have converted it. And it has to be reconverted. It's not actual information coming over. One more time, at its level, at the 3D level it is, because it serves a purpose. But for any greater purpose, it can be seen quite correctly. It's not actually being information. It's would-be instructions. It's hopeful instructions. It's partial instructions on how you might assemble some kind of information. Once you get one good glimpse of that, of course, you're freed, if you need to be, of any kind of sadness or disappointment that people never told you what you wanted to know, or that you always thought somebody was hiding something from you, or that people were too dumb, or they suddenly got dumb when you talked to them, or... It's not. It's like at that level, all the information is dot. It's instructions, would-be instructions at best, as to how you might assemble, how you might translate this into something else. And so back there it was serving the purpose quite well. What you were looking for was a equivalency. You were looking for the actual sending of the sound of the human voice, in my example, as opposed to having to have the human voice go, all right, make it say, "Dear Fred, we'll be there Wednesday." And they have to turn that analog into digital. They didn't call it that back then. Then, at the other end, that is you trying to get it from a book, from somebody else, or just from your own ordinary imagination, which is the same thing, your ordinary where you're plugged into the general flow of life. The information comes, and you never did realize it. It wasn't actually you hearing a voice saying, "Dear Fred," because that was your name. "Dear Fred, here's the information you wanted." Because it never was. But you didn't realize it wasn't actually "Dear Fred." What you were getting was a facsimile at the time. What you were getting was a bunch of dots and dashes. You were getting, at best, from the view of trying to do something extraordinary, or at least out of the ordinary, what you were getting was would-be instructions, hints, partial maps, sketches, blueprints of how to turn the dots and the dashes into some kind of meaningful information for your own purpose, not for Fred's purpose, not to help out Western Union, for your own purpose. Since we're talking about advertising and television, etc., I can use teasers and tune in tomorrow, plus to kill the several minutes left. Unless we all change our minds, or a comet hits us, or the creek don't rise, what I was going to get into to give you something to look forward to. Next time we tape, I was going to drag it into the area of computers and free will. Which I suggest will surprise some of you, even though many of you laughed right then, and if I stop and start what you're laughing at, I bet you come with some verbal of, "Oh, I bet you're going to say so-and-so." Now, you people don't, I think you'll like it. Unless, of course, you have some kind of subliminal, subconscious hatred or fear of computers. And if you do, of course, I guess it's good I mention it, because you can arrange to be ill next time we tape. Arrange to be out of town. Which is not the same as being out of your mind.